Hello, I'm Peter Moore, a writer and a historian. Here we have something very special indeed for you on Unseen Histories. It's a conversation about the author Patrick O'Brian, a writer who was called by the New York Times the greatest historical novelist of all time. There's two things that many readers and lovers of history know about Patrick O'Brian. First of all, that he was the most magnificent writer. He's most famous of all for his Aubrey-Maturin series of novels, sea stories, as he called them, set in the period of the Napoleonic Wars. These evoke with the greatest ability that rich, expansive, textured world governed by class and form and ingenuity that is so transfixing for us to look back upon today. Even non-readers will have come across some of O'Brian's storytelling through the 2003 feature film Master and Commander. The other thing people know about O'Brian is that he was a recluse. He lived his life determinedly out of the public gaze on the French Catalan coast. Only a tiny few actually knew him intimately, one of whom was his beloved wife Mary, with whom he was inseparable. Another was his stepson, Mary's child from her first marriage, Nikolai Tolstoy. Nikolai is a distinguished author himself, and he continues to write and live happily in a beautiful house near Oxford. There he spends much of his time in a library that's filled with books, many of which he inherited from his stepfather. It was in this room that I sat down for a chat with Nikolai about Patrick. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hello, Nikolai Tolstoy. This is a real pleasure. First of all, thank you very much for your time. We're here in this most enchanting of spaces, one of my favourite places of all, I have to say, surrounded by hundreds or maybe, I guess even thousands of books. And many of them once belonged to the novelist Patrick O'Brian, and they were central to his work. Could I begin by asking you just to say a few words about your own life, and if you could tell us how you're connected to Patrick?
Yes, I was connected to Patrick at a very early age, and indeed I've got a photograph taken by my mother, which is the first time I ever heard of Patrick. And it didn't mean much to me because I was only aged 5, I think. And I'm sitting on the lawn during the war at my grandparents' house in North Devon, where we went for the evacuation. And my mother was working in London with Patrick, but I think not yet married to him, I'm not sure. Anyway, was living in London, and they were both serving with ambulances, driving ambulances in the Blitz in Chelsea. And it was a very awkward place because it was where the Luftwaffe came up the Thames by moonlight and turned round at Battersea Power Station. And any bombs they had left, they had to drop on Chelsea. One went smack, I've got a picture of the house, smack on the house next door. Anyway, they survived. Anyway, my mother couldn't come very often, and so I've no childhood memories, well, about 3 fleeting ones of my mother. And she came, but I do remember this, I think it must have been because she had some passion in her voice, which I must have recognized. And she said, I've got a friend, and he's an author. Patrick wasn't a very successful author then, but he had as a child published books, so he was. And I didn't really know what an author was. And I must have asked my mother, and she said, to someone who writes books. So when my mother went back to London, I decided I would be an author too. And I took an exercise book and I wrote on the front the title. It was called The Lions. I then went, obviously I liked research and things like that, or thought I did at that age. I went and I wrote the index. And then I never got around to writing anymore. And years later, when I first got to know Patrick, I told him about this, and Patrick smiled and he said, I think it's the bit in between that counts usually.
I think I should say at the beginning, when I suggested this idea of having a conversation about Patrick to some of his online fans, of which there are very many, one of them replied and they said, I would humbly suggest that we would like to hear about our author's inspiration for his books, his research, his methods of writing, but not his private life, which is none of our business. And this line obviously echoes Patrick's own thinking, because he was very famously very reclusive, very private, and I've borne it in mind. But I do actually think it's fair to discuss what he called very disparagingly personal questions.
Yes.
For two reasons. First of all, Patrick, I think, is an immense figure in the history of English literature, not just in 20th century, but really his books, I think, transcend that. I think they're of such great quality that we kind of deserve to know as much as we can, because we're curious about the person who created them. But then second of all, it has to be pointed out, and I know that you pointed this out yourself, that Patrick did write biographies of Picasso, and he wrote about Joseph Banks, and he inquired into their personal lives because he saw how that was fundamental to the kind of people that they were. So I think we're kind of justified in talking a little bit about the personal side of Patrick too.
Yes, he was very ambivalent in my experience. And I didn't intend to write his biography, because had I done so, I would have collected much more and taken notes, etc., which I hadn't. And I knew he didn't like, as you say, he didn't like anything personal becoming known. But when he died, this position for me changed absolutely radically, because there was a ludicrous biography came out by Dean King, an American enthusiast who never actually met Patrick or anyone, because he told them not to speak them to anyone. He came here, but I told him, well, Patrick's asked me not to talk about it. Anyway, so he got nothing out of me. But the book itself was naively reviewed by people almost unanimously saying this is a breakthrough, now we know the real Patrick. It's full of the most childish mistakes. So I thought, well, it can't stay like that on the record. And I think I must have discussed it with the publisher. And so I decided to write his biography myself. And as I'd known him since I was 18, when I first met him, I knew him very well indeed. And so, but when I then did more research, I found just how wrong these things were. Patrick's ambivalence is shown by, well, he once wrote to me, I think I've still got the letter, and he said, Nikolai, when I die, I want you to come straight away out to Collioure and destroy all my private papers. Well, on reflection, when he died, I thought this is a rather odd request, because, I mean, how does he know I might not even be alive, or I might not be able to come? Somebody else might get into the house first. Surely if he wanted them destroyed, he would have destroyed them. So I didn't feel, because of that, I was poking into something. And I honestly think that he would have, I simply put down, and I found I knew much more than I thought I did when I came to it, as often happens. So I think it was, I'm perfectly satisfied. And I've given his faults as well. There's only one thing, and I've gone and forgotten what it is, which I do know now, which is of no great interest to anyone, which I've omitted. Otherwise, everything I know, it's 2 volumes, is there, good or bad, most of it good.
So can I take you back to your very first meeting with Patrick? It happened, I've looked in the biography, so I know with some clarity that it happened on the 1st of September 1955, and you're in Collioure, when the door of their little home swung open. And you actually describe this moment quite vividly in the book, where you are presented with the sight of this 40-year-old writer with whom your mother is now, to who she's married, and they're very quietly living away in France. What was it like? Do you remember?
Well, it was, for me, quite strange in one respect, because my mother was, for me, a stranger. I couldn't remember what she looked like, or I certainly didn't know what she was like. And but I felt I didn't get on very well with my father, and still less with my awful stepmother. So I decided one day that I would go and see my mother, and I must have corresponded. And we were on holiday in northern Spain, and then I left and came. And when I came to the door, my mother came out, and Patrick was behind me. I was thinking he was standing, he was Stephen Maturin sort of was, I think, had this sort of gesture. And Patrick had that with his head on one side, half smiling.
Yeah, let me describe that gesture, because I think it's quite characteristic of him. It's almost like the hands clasped
yes, it's
together.
like this, and then he's sizing you up
and
smiling, but you didn't quite know what he was thinking. And I noticed in the books, I think I was able to quote exactly this description of how Maturin when he first met Aubrey, I think. Whether it was shy, he was a bit quite shy, obviously, because he was a recluse, but I think a little bit of it was shyness. But very soon, of course, luckily we had an enormous amount in common. Even at that age, of course, I was only 20 just, but I loved the same period and loved history, loved literature of the period that he liked. So we should have got on very well, but actually we didn't. I think I was there about 3 or 4 weeks, and by the end, I'm afraid there was quite a coldness between us. I think, and I put it down to, on my part, being very youthful and bumptious and opinionated, as most people are at that age, thinking I knew a lot more than I knew. And on Patrick's side, it was very awkward because he was a great writer and he knew he had this in him, but he hadn't as yet published a great deal. He'd published the very good short stories and, of course, the children's books, none of which had I read. And so I think Patrick himself was on his mettle. And so we rather clashed. Well, with Patrick, you never clashed in open argument. He didn't like that. But just a coldness developed. And there were subsequent occasions when we had a slight difference, and he would suddenly he could take offense very easily. But luckily, because of my unique position in being my mother's son, he couldn't expel me from his life, and there were quite a lot of people who were simply, in his address book, there are people who are rather like the Soviets. They're just deleted as not existing anymore.
I was about to interject when you were talking, and it reminded me, one thing that you write about is Patrick's utter dislike of being interrupted. Is that correct? Because he liked to speak and to be listened to. Is that correct?
He certainly did, and quite often Georgina was amused by this. When he was speaking, he would pause, and I remember Georgina herself did blurt out some, out of politeness, I'm sure, a comment, and Patrick would turn up and he'd say, "If you will allow me to continue." But I mean, there'd been a pause of a couple of minutes or so, but no one knew that he was going to go on and say anything. And he did this when he was interviewed by the press in public. I think I remember someone telling me who was there in America, and he could be very. But I think it was two things. One was a natural shyness, which he did have. The other was a fear that there was something bad in about him would come to light. Well, actually, I've written everything, and there's nothing I would say was bad or worse than anyone else. But he was so hypersensitive on this.
Yeah, I suppose as well we should. I mean, the picture of the brooding author. I mean, there's a particular line in your account of this first visit where he doesn't explode, because obviously that wasn't Patrick's style, but he does remind you that he's a writer who's been compared with Dostoevsky.
He did say that on the first meeting, yes.
And I thought, well, you can read that in various ways. In a way, it's a very pompous thing for someone to state about themselves. But I think it's actually very revealing in this moment, because it shows that Patrick is aware that he's someone who possesses great gifts. He can write. He knows he can write, but at the same time, he's just really anonymous. And he was very poor as well at that point, wasn't he?
Very poor, yes. He was, but always very generous, and my mother too. And so they hid their poverty from me. Not I don't think primarily out of shame for it. They were living obviously a very contented life, and for me it seemed enviable. I never knew that they were badly off, but subsequently when I wrote the biography, I luckily had all my mother's accounts from the very earliest days. It shows how desperately poor they were. And I remember my mother, on one occasion, I always tell this story if I'm talking to people about Patrick, that she wrote in her diary, "I don't know, we've got, I don't know, £25 left in our account, and this is autumn, and we've got to get through. How are we going to get through to the new year?" About 4 years before he died, Patrick wrote to me and said, "This year I made my first £1 million."
Yeah.
So I thought, not many authors, especially today, I think, well, there must be some who have that revolution. Well, not many are so poor at the beginning. I think there are very few authors writing in garrets these days. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess there's something really nice about his career trajectory looking back at it now, because we can say
Yes,
that he was fulfilled and he was recognized eventually.
yes,
But there was a long period that ran up to that. I thought it'd be quite nice if I read some of Patrick's prose out, just so I could ask you,
yes.
because it's very distinct and it feels very poetic at points. So this is a little snippet from the third of the Aubrey-Maturin novels, which is HMS Surprise, from early on in the book. Okay, and he writes, "In Whitehall, a grey drizzle wept down upon the Admiralty, but in Sussex the air was dry and perfectly still. The smoke rose from the chimney of the small drawing-room at Mapes Court in a tall and wavering plume, 100 feet before its head drifted away, in a blue mist to lie in the hollows of the downs behind the house. The leaves were hanging yet, but only just, and from time to time the bright yellow rounds on the tree outside the window dropped of themselves, twirling in their low fall to join the golden carpet at its foot, and in the silence the whispering impact of each leaf could be heard, a silence as peaceful as an easy death."
Wonderful, isn't it?
The
Yes.
quality of that I mean, the images, I mean, there's no
And there's such a
action.
succession of them.
There's no action at all. There's no real plot there.
No.
This is all pure descriptive writing about a leaf falling off a tree
Yes.
and some smoke rising into the air, the changing of the seasons.
It's
Where
fun.
did that love of nature come from? Do you know?
Oh, I know that because I think particularly from childhood in Sussex, where his father, who's like Jack Aubrey's father, was always indigent, and he was a doctor and was going for outre cures and so on. And he even proudly invented a gadget for preventing people from going into telephone boxes and not paying their fare, paying the penny. In those days you had to pay, which immediately locked the door behind them, so they were stuck till the police came. But I'm not sure it would ever work. But that was what he was like. And then he had to move, because of his indigence, to Sussex, to Lewes, which of course was perfect for Patrick, because it is still a beautiful 18th century town, and with it, but also with a medieval castle. And Patrick would go out and play, and I recognize a lot of that in the very beginning of Richard Temple, which is largely autobiographical. And he would wander along the River Ouse looking at fish and things. And there are little scraps I found written from those days, which were certainly prefaced this very majestic piece. And what's so wonderful is it's not, if it were almost any other author writing today, it would constitute padding between two bits of drama. But with Patrick, it all flows. And it's very wonderful, though, how he remembered, because he didn't stay very long in England after that. He was in Collioure. But everything was secured in his memory.
Was Sussex, in that sense, a really powerful landscape for him? Were there any alternative ones that you think were as strong? Or do you think...
Other ones come into it, and even I think when he first moves into Mapes Court, or somewhere they go, and it's recognisable as being the house that Georgina and I first bought in North Wales. And they had lived in North Wales in their poverty. Oh, it's next door, but there's a picture, in a tiny cottage. So I think, yes, sorry, that makes me remember that he would have had a very vivid picture of North Wales, for example, the grim winters and the mountains, and the hunting too.
Well, how long did it take you from your first acquaintance, so back in 1955? I mean, it must be very difficult, but did you appreciate how good he was? Did he send you his work? Were you familiar with, I suppose that was at the time he was writing The Golden Ocean and these kind of preludes to the Aubrey-Maturin novels, and the later kind of quite gloomy novels that he wrote when he was a younger, tortured soul, maybe?
Yes, I know. I didn't read many of them at that time, but I remember when I first stayed, I particularly admired among the short stories, and I liked all the Irish background, though I still hadn't myself been to Ireland. I went the next year to Trinity. And but the Virtuous Peleg, which is a sort of pastiche, a comical pastiche of an Irish saint's life, which now is something I'm very familiar with, struck me as brilliant, both funny and touching, and capturing the essence of what this early Celtic literature.
And was he an encouraging figure for you? Because you were at this point, I mean, you said earlier on you'd got this ambition to become a writer from a very young age. I guess you were moving forward with that. Was Patrick? Was he helpful to you?
He was very helpful and very kind. He might easily have thought, possibly even did think that some of this is rather jejune, and but he would always be encouraging and virtuous, and he would be frank, but very, very tactfully. So you could never be hurt, or even as a young man when I hadn't yet published anything, his advice, and it was always practical and helpful. I've still got, well, they're now in the British Library, letters from him, and it's always constructive, never destructive. He could be of other people, but he was very kind to me.
Yeah. And so your visits became more frequent, almost an annual affair, really. You'd spend your summers in the south of France with him. And after this initial kind of clashing of horns, if you like, you really became much closer, didn't you, over, the 1960s into the 70s?
Georgina would say, a particularly tactful person. I learned that it wasn't difficult to find how not to upset him and to keep things on an even keel. So sometimes he would take offense, but now I can't even remember. I just remember the fact. But nothing happened like the very first and a rather disastrous visit. I'm sure if I weren't my mother's son, I never would have seen Patrick again. And so many people were cut off from their lives. It could, of course, be simply that they were too far away, but others, he definitely... And the address book, there are comical things. I won't say who it was, but there's a quite a well-known writer who stayed with his wife. And Patrick, my mother, I think, who's never questioned anything Patrick said or did, in the address book has crossed their names out and put never again.
Can I ask you about the relationship between your mother and Patrick? One of the things that's really striking to anyone who reads his novels is how time and time again they're always dedicated to your mother. I mean, it seems like she was such a fundamental part of his life, obviously, but even beyond that, it was a real love match, wasn't it?
It was, and once he went to try and I think his writing was going badly, so he went to Vienna and lived with some Austrian princess who they would let rooms in their castle. And there was an agonizing letter. He hadn't received a letter from my mother for a week. And he wrote, please write, I can't go on without you. And that summed it up, really, for all his life. But it was in some ways, and obviously I saw it all at first hand, very close up, just us alone initially in a tiny one-room flat, not a flat, in Collioure. So we were really hugger-mugger. I slept in a sort of low cupboard under the wall. And so I have to say, my mother was not a very intellectual person, and she was not particularly well read, but somehow I think she expressed herself through Patrick. And Patrick, in turn, he always wanted her opinion, but he would often quote humorously what Mae West saying, don't give me criticism. What I want is unstinted praise. Well, I think that's he recognized it in himself, but authors do need that, and otherwise, if you're on your own, some people can get away with writing. But
so what did she supply that was so important for him? Did she have a real strength of character?
She did, actually, and she, like Leo Tolstoy's wife, she typed every single one of his books, sometimes more than once, and I think she had a sort of instinct. She would praise something that she thought was good, but he I think, I got the impression, had the gut feeling that what she hadn't praised wasn't quite up to scratch.
Yeah.
And so from this, she never tried, as she obviously couldn't, impose things on him, but cunningly or intuitively steered him into right paths. And he recognized that. And but also he needed her company. And when she died, luckily he had died only, I think, 2 years later, he was just distraught and wandered from one. He was at Collioure, then he had plenty of money, so he could go where he liked. Then we'll go to London, then he'd get restless, go off to New York and back again, back to Collioure, always back to Collioure.
I guess he's been in this room then. I should ask you.
Oh, often, yes.
Yeah, so
yes.
This is another place that he wandered to. But he was a very hard-working writer as well, wasn't he?
Yes.
So even though he had the natural talent, and he'd got his subject he'd got the books. We might talk about those in a moment. He worked really hard at what he did.
He was very, very hard working, very conscientious. He could be easily put out. I remember if I had brought a friend, which I did once or twice at university, or even if I outstayed my welcome, I know what it's like, because now I have felt it myself. You're torn, you want to see someone, but when you get back in your workroom, you can't concentrate because that person is still in the house. And I remember instances of that happening, even with me. And I think just the same as me, you afterwards regret it and think, why was I so testy and impatient? But of course, if you're committed to writing, you can't escape that.
Could you tell us what would a working day be like for Patrick? Was he a morning person? Was he very rigid in his timekeeping?
Yes, rigid. He would go straight down after breakfast he had this in Collioure, a strange, tiny place, much smaller than this. It was like a cave because they had a vineyard going down, sloping quite steeply from the house. And there was this place where they had a terrace or balcony, and under it there was a bit of a gap left, and that's where Patrick did his writing. And he had the most, for instance, he'd have the Naval Chronicle and things like that, but not many books around him.
Just the book of the day,
exactly
as it was needed.
And I can't say, I mean, I've got all the books I wanted from his library. I didn't take away paperbacks or ephemeral things. But I can't say that because a book wasn't there, that he didn't read it, because he belonged to the London Library, so he would get books sent and returned regularly.
Well, let's, as we're on books, let's just have a think about it, because the two characters who, are the ones which most people will know him through are Jack Aubrey, the captain whose Royal Navy career is so full of incident and gallantry, and Stephen Maturin, who is the quiet philosopher. It's one of the great friendships, shall we say, in literature, I think, is the best way. And I asked you before we started this to pick two books, because I was wondering where these characters come from. They're obviously compounded from many sources, and it's not a simple question. But because we've got these books here, I thought it'd be good just to look at two, one for each. So could you pick one up? Let's have a little look.
This is Falconer's Dictionary of the Marine, which is a complete encyclopedia for use by naval captains. It's dated 1769, so it's perfect timing. He did use a subsequent edition later than the Napoleonic War, slightly later. Then he got this one, which is, of course, ideal, because if it's in here, then it's something that Jack Aubrey could and indeed would have read.
Well, let me just talk about this, because it's incredible to see this. Have a little look. I'm going to hold it myself here. What would you say? It's not a big folio size. It's probably half the size of that. I'm not quite sure.
It's a complete dictionary of everything you need to know, including the orders, etc.
Yeah, so all of these like extended scenes where you have the management of the ship at sea, of how it wears, and tacks,
Yes.
and the millions of different descriptions of knots and sails and rigs and strange parts of the ship that kind
Yes.
of litter the novels. We're probably consulted for in here, and actually it's so funny because I don't know, I've just opened up a random page, and I think this is quite typical. You've got one of Patrick's own
Oh, yes.
diagrams here. If you look here,
That is the...
so let's see, what does it say? Let's have a look. It says an average of, it's talking about barometric readings, and this is all very precise, beautiful sketching. Maybe I can take a photo of this.
Yes, I think that's the
but it
surprise.
shows,
I'm not sure.
I don't know, what is this? This is obviously one of the ships which is in the novels.
Yes.
And it shows, it's basically a ship's plan which shows where the surgeon is, where the lieutenants are, and the warrant officers are. And in a way you can see a little bit of his method, because before the descriptions have begun.
Yes, you can see he's so meticulous and fascinated by detail. But he always said, like Georgina says sometimes, or like, the only thing I don't like about the books is all the technical descriptions of things. But Patrick always said if someone heard from someone, they found it a bit hard. He said, look, you're not meant to understand it or retain it. You're on the ship, and these are the things that would have been happening, and you just take them in your stride. You don't have to remember them.
Yeah, I've seen him in an interview be questioned about this, and he says it just has to be right. It's like a determination.
Yes.
And a friend of mine said he had a friend who had sailed in the Navy, and they only found one mistake in the whole 20 novels. So I think his level of accuracy was extraordinary.
Yes.
But this is the kind of book that would have been familiar to a Jack Aubrey kind of character.
Yes, exactly. I would imagine any post captain would have had that on board with him.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything about Aubrey? What do you think?
You mentioned earlier, where did these two characters come from? I'm pretty sure I know. They both come from Patrick himself. Well, Patrick himself, whenever I'm reading one of the books and read about Maturin, I just see Patrick in front of me. So it's definitely him. And the Irish background, I think, is something Patrick went to Ireland more often than people had known. Indeed, it was even suggested he never went there until much later in life. But that's not true. I discovered he even fell in love with a girl up in the north.
Yeah.
And I think he felt, as I did, and when I went to Ireland, and I've no direct Irish connection, but I fell in love with the country, and he did too. So that made. But otherwise, it was. I think, of course, Jack Aubrey is completely dissimilar from Patrick, but nevertheless, I'm pretty certain it's how Patrick would, in one side of him, would like to have been. He would have liked to have been a valiant, jovial, a great physically big man. Patrick was, average height, but shy and was quite slight. I'm sure he wished he had all that confidence. I mean, it was like the time I remember when he had got a good advance and the series was taking off. He rushed and bought a set of solid silver plates for their dinner at Collier. And Jack Aubrey does actually buy a set of silver plates too at one point. So I think what he liked about Jack Aubrey is, on the one hand, he came of a respectable, well, more than respectable and gentlemanly family, where Patrick's his father was nothing to be ashamed of, but at the same time they were not particularly grand or anything. They were of German origin.
Yeah.
We know that. So the father was a bit of a tyrant and also well over 6 foot giant and a little bit of, I think, of a bully. So that was the bad side, and Patrick wanted to create a more, as you say, a structured and ordered background for himself through his character. And so I think that, and sometimes people criticize Maturin for having been, as he quite often says, to Trinity, where I went, and that he couldn't have gone because he was a Catholic. But once again, Patrick is practically always right, because Trinity officially didn't allow Catholics to enter its portals at the time. Maturin would have been there. But unofficially, it did. And they were so that Patrick once, but I don't know that Patrick knew that. He knew so much by a tremendous feel for the period, so he could often anticipate things, and very, very rarely indeed made any sort of error.
Let's talk about Stephen then for a moment, who is much more like Patrick, really. I mean, the way you described his stance and how Stephen would be slightly, not a sinister presence, but definitely a presence of sorts, often silent, very thoughtful, the secret codes, the jotting things down in darkened corners when people aren't looking.
Yes.
That was very Patrick, wasn't it?
Very Patrick, yes, exactly. And he was quite secretive, and occasionally could flare up, and then it would all quickly subside again. And physically, he obviously looked like, I mean, in the film, I rather wish they'd have someone who looked a bit more like Patrick, but it was still very good. And he had what I should say, he had a marvelous sense of humor. Well, that, of course, comes across very much in the books.
Yeah.
And there was no sort of envy when we were together. If I made a joke or told him a funny story about something happening in Ireland, he would love it and burst out laughing.
Brilliant.
And many of those stories come into his books.
So which book have you chosen for Stephen?
Well, I think this is a book which I had choose one, but this is actually what I would have chosen, because I can't say what Patrick, the Irish side of Stephen, where he got it from. He got it very well, because having been there for 5 years myself at Trinity, he doesn't put a foot wrong, even the slight intonation with Irish intonation.
Yeah.
But if it were me choosing, I would have chosen these inimitable memoirs of the same period, the memoirs of Sir Jonah Barrington, which are full of wonderful accounts of wild Irishmen and their habits and the duels and everything else, covering exactly the same period.
So how were this is a really important aspect of the novels, isn't it? Which is the Irish flavour of Maturin. And obviously in Master and Commander, there's this very explicit plot line which follows the United Irishmen.
Oh, yes, of course. And Dylan is a former United Irishman, isn't he?
And there's a kind of real tension there in politics that he's trying to eke out.
Yes.
So
well, I think, like many people, including me, who loved Ireland or went there, as Patrick had done before the war, just got carried away with it. It's changed a lot now. I fear for the worse, but it was. And things that people, as I'm writing my own autobiography, I've been writing about Trinity days, and people might think now, well, that's just you being Irish, but it actually was like that, and these wonderful eccentric sayings and so on. And Patrick loved it when I would recount these when I arrived on the vacation from Trinity. I suspect quite often. Well, he did. I know he noted them down because some of them are direct quotes.
Wonderful. Music. I just thought I'd ask you about Patrick and music for a little bit, because the novels, in a way, start with that scene in Port Mahon.
Yes.
There's a musical concert that's being played, and that's where Maturin and Aubrey first meet. And in a way, the point where their two very different personalities do meet throughout the series is in their love of music. So they have they hold it in such high regard. And there's lots of nice scenes of them in the great cabin with the dead water behind and the music in the air in front. But did Patrick have a real love of music himself?
Oh, he did, and he would. There was a very good program. We used to have one like it on the radio, France Musique, and played, instead of like our Classics FM, tiny snippets, it would play entire symphonies. But I was amused once because he recorded them and then played the tape recordings. And I was listening to one, and it came, said, now the next piece is by, I think it was Saint-Saëns. Patrick, there's a sort of scrabbling noise, and Patrick turns it off because Saint-Saëns was far too modern for his liking.
Wow.
So it is really, so he was steeped in the music of Boccherini and Mozart and Haydn and so on.
Which also brings me on to another point, which is about him being a very much a kind of man out of time in a way. There's a wonderful quote. This is from Patrick's diary in 1996. Actually, it goes into your biography, and it's a wonderful snippet because he writes, "I tried putting up the vacuum cleaner. A frightful struggle. Holes mismeasured, instructions misunderstood. But at last I got it into place with the machine charging. A rotten day. But at night I dreamt a JA and SM piece with great pleasure. Visual images, SM being smaller and older than I'd thought in an old black coat." And I think it's a wonderful entry because, there he is taking solace in his imagination and the past.
Yes.
I don't know why he couldn't work out the vacuum cleaner, which can't be that complicated.
Anything mechanical.
But was he that bad? Was he?
Yes, he was. And Georgina was really amused because when we stayed there a couple of times after Patrick sadly had died, and we had to sort out the house, the Mr. Me wondered, well, the house couldn't be set on fire because it was all made of concrete, I think, but wiring, it was completely wired by Patrick. So there were cables was dangling all over the place. And he loved to work things out, and I quoted him the other day to Georgia because I couldn't find something very important. And I discovered when I was going through that, I think in a silver teapot, a note by Patrick, and he left notes for himself. He talked to himself and write notes that we found, and they would say things like supper on left-hand side of third shelf in fridge. But the one in the teapot simply said, "Never, never put anything precious where you think it's safe." And I lost something the other day like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So these dialogues, where my mother wasn't there, he continued them with himself.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the other thing about technology, I suppose it's a connection, is like how many of these car crashes they seem to have. Because again, this is the man out of time picture. There's someone who was so at ease in a 38 gun frigate at sea in the Mediterranean, could not for the life of him be trusted with a Citroen 2CV on the roads of France. They had so many car crashes, didn't they? And they were all somebody else's fault.
Always someone else's fault, yes. And I'm sorry to say that it usually resulted because Patrick had that attitude. And he'd be driving on the wrong side of the road, and he'd shout out, of course they couldn't hear, "Get out of my way, you idiot." Yeah. And then when they drove off the side of the canal and nearly drowned and couldn't get out. And I remember once we were driving with Patrick and my mother, and we were going up the rather steep and perilous road, creeping up the side of one of the mountains of the Pyrenees. And Georgie, who can drive, unlike me, held my hand, and she said, "There's something wrong with the car, I'm sure." And I said, "Oh, it's all right." But then she got so nervous. I said, "Oh, dear Patrick, I think George is worried that there's something wrong. We're bumping a lot." And Patrick said, "No, there's nothing wrong, whatever." Ridiculous. But then it went on, and then my mother said, "Oh, Patrick, I think I can hear some bumping." So we got out, and the back rear wheel on the outside to the fall, which looked like miles below, the last nut on the wheel was still holding it. The wheel was about to fall over the edge, and us, I guess, with it. But he still wouldn't admit that there was anything particularly wrong.
And this proximity to danger as well. I think you say that for many years they slept in a bedroom with a box of dynamite above their head.
Oh, yes, I've forgotten that. Yes, exactly. From the building of Patrick himself insisted at first on operating the dynamite, and a huge stone. My mother described it in her diary that flew past her head, and that actually did make Patrick realise. And he got in some Catalan miners from the north over the border to do the rest of the work. But he always had to try and do it himself, and he loved doing things with his hands and fingers.
Yeah, I should say, like, apart from the books in here, there's lots of Patrick's things, aren't there? Some really quite curious objects.
Yeah.
Over in the distance, I can see Stephen Maturin's pincers, I think.
That's it, yes. And also a curious instrument for working out latitude. I'm not even sure how.
Yeah, that's a curiosity. But then down in the other direction, there's a Noah's Ark that he made for your children in the 70s. It's very charming little.
Yes, he would go. He built it in the garage, and between writing chapters, he would go in there and work away at it. And finally, it's got a very amusing letter inside. I think it says something to the effect. I've still got the letter. It says something to the effect that the odd creatures with marks on their backs are meant to be leopards. And there's, I can get the letter later, yes.
And then, I mean, other things are, I don't know, there's a hat down there, the Trilby hat,
and
the
his
briefcase.
And his gown he got when he was given an honorary degree at Trinity. He was very rightly very pleased with that.
Do you think when all the success came in the 1990s, which was a success on an absolutely huge scale, did it change him, or did he remain very much the same?
He remained very much the same. He wasn't. He would indulge in a cheerful boast, like saying that he'd won his first £1 million, because he knew I would also be entertained and pleased by it. So he wasn't super modest, but essentially he didn't change. No, I think he felt that the earlier books were good, and simply people hadn't had the sense to recognize it.
But what about the paranoia? Because I suppose in a way, the Patrick that a lot of people hold in their minds is the Patrick of, say, about 1997, 1998. This enigmatic creature who writes beautiful books, beyond question, brilliant books, but who is crabby, does not like to be interviewed, and obviously from the inside, you know that this was the point where he was being pursued by Dean King for information about his private life that he did not want to give up. There was a whole kind of question about his identity, is like obviously the change of name from his early life, and whether he'd been to sea or whether he'd been Irish at all. Did this make him a paranoid character?
It did to some extent. Yes, it did. He became, because he was so famous and so successful, of course, it did aroused a certain amount of genuine envy among rather ludicrous people. I mean, if they're ludicrous people, then it's ludicrous to worry about them. But Patrick did worry. But I think it still lingered on, this fear that, well, there were two material things where the fact that his name had been changed and that he wasn't in fact Irish at all. He lived in dread that people would find that out. And even in the privacy of his house, books that had been written by his father, Dr. Russ, I only discovered them. They'd been hidden away because, of course, it gave the game away with it, Russ as the surname. And I think it made his paranoia worse, not better, that he became famous, because there was all this danger that somebody somewhere, and of course the fool king, as Patrick quite rightly called him, seemed to be doing just that. And in fact he was. And what's more, it realized Patrick's worst fears. He knew he'd make himself open to misrepresentation. But I do remember once he was at Trinity and they let him have rooms there because of his honorary degree, and I went over there so I slept in the same room on the sofa, and Patrick said to me, I've just had a letter from this man, Dean King, who wants to meet me. And I was very surprised because it was one of the very few occasions, perhaps the only one I can remember, where he actually not only asked my advice, but was clearly wanted it and would take it. And he said, I don't want to see him. I think it's a mistake. And then he said, but what would you do if it was you? Well, I was quite well known by then, so it was similar. And I said, well, to be honest, I think these people are going to write anyway. I'd be inclined to see him because then at least you can't control what he writes, but at least he will know the truth. And actually, the truth is usually more appetizing than lies. And Patrick looked very happy suddenly, and he said, "You're right, I'll do that. And I'll write to my agent tomorrow." The correspondence were going through the agent. And then Dean King, getting desperate, had published by pure mischance for him in some American well-known magazine an article about Patrick. I don't think it was disparaging, but it was certainly wrong-headed. And then the agent sent this to Patrick, and Patrick flew into quite a rage. He said, "I'm not going to see that scoundrel." And so poor Dean King, who the one thing he wanted was to meet the great man, destroyed it inadvertently himself.
How would you like Patrick to be remembered? Because obviously you have your own very close relationship with him. I suppose it should be said that there's only a very small number of people who actually really knew Patrick at all. Maybe your mother, you, yes. Maybe a few other
and even the people who came, like William Wargrave, he was a genuine fan. And Patrick, I think he liked him too, of course, because he himself, Wargrave was Provost of Eton and so on like that. So Patrick didn't quarrel with him, but the only person he didn't. And so Wargrave has actually been quite a good ally. But even they, I don't say it to make myself the only person who did know him, but I just know they never knew the real Patrick because he put on a completely different, well, not completely different, but another Patrick for their benefit. And wanted them, probably more frightened that they would find out and be disillusioned. Of course, they wouldn't have been disillusioned. There wasn't anything bad to hide at all, I didn't think. And I think I now more or less know everything. And even if he did the odd discreditable, especially in his youth, he was so alarmed about. And he was also distressed by the fact that he'd not had any of the smart education, which other people whom he looked up to more than they deserved, I guess. In fact, I think I'm right from memory. You may remember, I don't think he ever passed a single examination.
No, which is an incredible
he left school,
thing,
didn't go to university. Chucked out of the RAF.
Yeah, but when you look at the depth of learning that he had, the fact that he couldn't get through an exam.
I know, it's extraordinary. I wonder if he was, as I was to some extent, gripped with nerves. But an exam does put you on your mettle in a horrible way.
Yeah.
I can quite see Patrick getting so tense that he wouldn't be able to do anything, even though, of course, he knew miles more. Probably.
So that question again to you, how would you like Patrick to be remembered?
Well, I'd like him to be remembered as he would, as someone who's given immense pleasure to an enormous number of people. And luckily, I've given it or sold it to the British Library. My mother religiously kept all the letters. I think one says fans, and I think another one, a very small one, says stupid letters.
Well, listen, it's been a real pleasure. I'm going to keep looking at his books after we finish this, hopefully. But yeah, what a great thing to talk about Patrick and remember his writing, his life.
Yes, because it brings him back to life. And actually, even though he had this acerbic side, I know memory edits things, but I can remember everything. But all I really think of is a very kind, extremely generous person, and someone who, after all, gave his life to making other people happy by reading his books.
That was me, Peter Moore, talking to Count Nikolai Tolstoy about his stepfather, Patrick O'Brian. And yes, for those of you wondering, Nikolai is related to Leo Tolstoy as well. The enchanting piece of Boccherini was played specially for us by the very talented Adele Etheridge-Woodson. Thank you to her, to Maria Nolan for producing the finished interview, and Sharon McLean for the transcription. Please do let us know if you enjoyed this, and if so, we'll see if we can bring some more of these interviews to you. In the meantime, we've created a rich page full of extra information all about Patrick O'Brian and Nikolai Tolstoy on Unseen Histories, and you can browse that along with a host of author interviews and original historical features at unseenhistories.com. Please do check it out. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.